Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. This is Franz Sidney. Welcome to Create with Franz. This is the show that helps you to find solutions for everyday problems. And today I have a special guest all the way from Oklahoma, and her name is Marianne Matzo. Ciao, Marianne.
Ciao. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here. I was just talking to Marianne offline. I realized her parents are actually from Italy, from the south of Italy. So I am Italian. So I was having a little chat about things and, so much to talk about here. And I could talk for the whole day, but we want to really stick to the subject. And the subject matter today is a little bit more sober than my usual. It's about talking to children about death. Because as her own website says, everyone dies. Everyone dies. Our pets die, our grandparents die, our friends die, and we will die. Eventually, it is part of life, and death is it's a cycle. And some people find this really hard to explain. Also, it varies depending on the age of a child, if it's verbal or not, if he can read or not. Is he getting information from which sources? So there are lots of points to touch. And Marianne, during her work at university, found out that this was quite an interesting topic. And in the end, after retiring, she decided to really spend some time to try to help people to talk about death in a different way. So I'm very happy to have you here. And let me tell you a little bit about it. What are the issues that happen when you don't know how to talk about death? Is there any problem about that?
Well, children need to have sort of clear information, and children get messages about death from a variety of sources, but in particular, their parents, their friends, from the media. And adults don't really want to talk about it because they think the subject's too unpleasant, or it's frightening, or it's even unnecessary. Why do you have to talk to children about death?
Hmm.
The other thing that happens is also that parents really talk about death in a confusing way. And that confusing way that they talk about it can be really harmful for kids. So instead of telling children why and how people die, they might focus on downplaying the emotionality, the seriousness, the reality of death because of their own fears of death, and also about the way that their parents told them about it. So this disinformation can lead to misunderstanding and to the fear of death. And it really sort of fosters the isolation that the child might feel in terms of their experience with death as a part of life. If we don't teach our children that everyone dies, that this is just a part of life, birth is a part of life, death is a part of life, then they pick up the fears that we're, relaying to them.
Hmm.
So what children really need is a common framework and language to communicate about death. And so that's really what I would like to talk with you about today, is how to talk to kids about death.
Yes. How do we? Where do we start?
So children need to get the message about death that is consistent. And that's really hard. So, Franz, I don't know, do you remember how your parents told you about death or where you learned about death the first time you heard about it?
Yes. Well, as an Italian, I had the pleasure, if you want to call it, to attend many funerals. The first one that I remember, it was 1975, so I was 10. I'm just turned 60. And I went to this funeral, and there was my great grandfather, who was 92, and he just died. He was never been to the doctor, never been ill. And then one day he said to his sister, I got a little bit of a headache. And he went upstairs, fourth floor, to sleep. And then they found him dead. And then next, I was at his funeral looking at him. And my grandmother told him, touch him, give him a kiss. And he looked like he was made of wax.
Mhm.
And then I thought, oh, is that what dead people look like? And I kissed him and I was like, oh, he's very cold. But nobody told me anything about it. everyone was crying, and because of being Sardinian, and this also happened in Sicilia, Calabria, and I think probably in Spain, all the women were dressed in black, and they stayed dressed in black for a long while because there was a sign to show the grievance. And so there was no explanation, but grandma was very Catholic, and so sometimes she put death with punishment in the same sentence. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have the greatest idea. However, I just felt the peace that he was gone somewhere. I have no idea what happened to him. That's the only experience I have. But then we went to lots of weddings and funerals. So we got used to the idea of all these people crying, the people at the cemetery, and this person that was so lively. And I thought, they cannot be down there. This is not them. That's all I
Mm-hmm.
know.
So, you learned about it sort of just by being there and seeing it. Uh, Kids nowadays, though, parents really wonder, well, should I take my child to a funeral? Is this appropriate to do? And a lot of parents decide, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to
Mm.
take them to the funeral. And when I've talked to adults, as those kids have grown up, they'll talk to me about how angry they still are that they were left out of that experience, that they weren't allowed to go to their grandparents' funeral or to their parents' funeral, if that was the case, that they were isolated from that. And so you really have to look at the age of the child. You have to look at the maturity of the child. And also what's important is preparing the child. I don't know if anybody said to you, so here's what's going to happen. But a lot of parents don't. They're just like,
No.
just behave, don't run around. And then you get
Mm.
there and there's this person that you cared about who's laying in a coffin and you're like, wait a minute, what is this?
Yeah.
And like for me, I'm a few years older than you, but not much. Nobody explained anything to me when my grandfather died.
Mm.
And I had questions. I still do have this very kind of curious mind. I had questions about how it was, what it was all about. And nobody would talk about that. And so what I'm going to tell you today is talk about it. I'm going to help you learn how to talk about it. So, parents might, in fact, think that, well, this is not something that I really need to do. But children have a lot of questions, and mostly what they'll say is, well, why did they die? And so let's kind of talk about how children understand about death.
Mm.
So they learn about death either if they go to a funeral, the stories that we read. Um, Sometimes in the past, some of the storybooks that children learned to read from had stories about death. That's not true anymore. They learn it from the movies that they watch. And Disney movies were, the ones that we kind of grew up on were very heavy on the death of animals and think of Bambi, where
Yes.
Bambi's mom is shot, and you see her get shot, and you see the grief that Bambi has. It's it's right there, the Lion King, um, watching, Simba watching his father, you know, be killed, be trampled down. So they're learning about death, but do we ever kind of stop or even while you're watching it talk about what is it that we're seeing? What is it that happened? And so the movies and the books and these experiences have informed children of generations. Here's what death is all about. And including you. You're listening to it, think about how did you learn about it? What were the books and the movies you watched? And how you do with death depends on your experiences, your understanding. And after today, you kind of put it all together to help the children that are in your lives. Because honestly, I really think that we can do better. I've been a nurse for 46 years. I've been a hospice nurse and an oncology nurse. And I see the fear that people have and the misunderstanding that people have. Part of the fear is like your grandmother, and the church even putting, the the wage of sin is death. It's like you misbehave, you could die.
Otherwise.
And you know, that's in our heads. And so death is it a punishment? What did I do that my father had to die? What did I do wrong that my dog is now dead? You know, it we bring it around to we're being punished for something.
Yes.
Now, the other piece of it is how children understand about death is dependent on their age. You can't expect a 5-year-old to have the same understanding as a 10-year-old or as a 15-year-old or as a 20-year-old. Developmentally, they're different. And so how they understand death is going to be different. For example, children under the age of 5 don't understand that death is final and inevitable. So if their if their goldfish dies, they'll be like, walk around holding it, waiting for it to wake up. And you say, it's not going to wake up. Death is forever. Now, when you're under 5, forever is from now until dinner time. So there's no concept of forever either,
Good point. Good point.
So that's why I'm saying you've got to look at that age of the child. Children who are the ages like between 5 and 9 don't acknowledge the permanence and the inevitability of death. And they think that death only applies to older adults. Just think about you when you were 10 years old. Who was dying? It wasn't your peers. You weren't going to the funerals of your peers. You're going to the funerals of grandfathers or older aunts or those kinds of people. Those occurrences where a child died. I don't know if you had that experience as a child. I didn't know of any children who died. So you just, these things come from your experience. And so you think, well, that's just something that happens to old people. So if children don't have a full understanding, they make up stories. They try to fill in the gaps. It's called confabulating. And so their understanding comes from whatever little bit of information that they may have. And that information comes from their actual experience, along with what they've been told and how well they process and understand this information. So I want you to think about, there's really 4 basic concepts about death that children need to understand. So when you're talking about children, to children about death, you can kind of keep these in your head. The first concept that children need to understand is that death is irreversible. There's not something you can do once somebody has died to bring them back. I was watching a documentary the other night, and this 10-year-old was talking about this dead child, and he was saying to the police, well, isn't there something that you can do to fix him? And the policeman's like, no, he's dead. He can't be fixed. And so death is irreversible. It's permanent. It can't be fixed. It can't be reversed. Now, in cartoons, television shows, movies, video games, kids see characters die and then they come back to life.
Tom and Jerry.
And so, yeah. So they see this and they think, well, okay, that's what happens. And sometimes, it might be obvious to us as adults that we need to say to kids, that's not how it is. kids don't know things unless we tell them.
Yeah.
So it's like, that's not how it is. In real life, this is not going to happen. If somebody or something, some living being dies, they're not going to pop right back up again and come back. And, you can say that. Children do not fully understand this concept, and they view death as a sort of temporary separation. They think of people who've died as being far away, or they went on a trip. And sometimes more often than not, it's the adults who reinforce this misunderstanding by talking about the person who died as having gone on a long journey, or, they had to go away. They didn't, they didn't, they didn't go away. They died. And I am a very strong advocate of using correct words with children and adults. We didn't lose somebody. They didn't pass away. They died. And if we communicate in a way that's clear, children will understand what we're talking about. And I think as a society, we need to start using the real words. People are born. We don't have, these other magic words. The stork didn't bring the baby. They were born. And, we it's it's a loss we feel, but we didn't lose the person who died. They died. So children who've had a family member or friend die also might feel angry that the person doesn't call or doesn't return for important occasions, doesn't show up for their birthday party. They need to be reminded dead is dead. They can't come back. If they could come back, they would, but they can't because they're dead. They didn't just go on a vacation and are choosing not to come to your birthday party. They can't. So if children do not think that death is permanent, they also don't have any reason to mourn. Mourning is a real painful process. It requires people to adjust their ties to the person who's died. If you acknowledge that somebody's dead, you have to change your relationship changes with that person because they're not there every single day or whatever the relationship was. So an essential first step in this process is understanding at some level and accepting that this loss is permanent. And that's hard. That's hard to say this person has died and they are not going to come back. Because when you use, I've even had adults who said to me, if I use the word that they're died, then I have to acknowledge that they're not coming back. And I don't want to acknowledge that. So I'm not going to say that they died. And so, it's sort of like this fantasy world that an adult can choose to live in. And, like this person had insight to know that that was what was going on. But that's not the reality. And to do that to a child who's developmentally not even making that choice is, I don't think, fair or healthy. So the second concept is that it's final. All life functions end completely at the time of death. Dead is dead. Very young children view all things as living. Their sisters alive, their toys alive. The mean rock tripped them when they went out walking. And in daily conversations, adults can say, oh, is your dolly hungry? Did your dolly wet her diaper? And you talk about the dolly like it's alive. And so they don't, children, that gets confusing for them. I'm not saying you shouldn't play, that kind of thing with your child, but or we can even say, gee, I'm late for dinner because my car died. Well, when we use that word out of context, if we don't explain to the child that it didn't really die, it broke. Do you see what I'm saying? Is like there's a difference between died and the car broke. And isn't it really better to just use the word that the
Yeah.
car broke?
Also because
But
a car you can replace bits all over until you replace most of
that's
it.
right. We haven't gotten that way with people. So
Not yet.
the, adults understanding that there's a difference. We know that pretending a doll is hungry and believing, in fact, that the doll is hungry, that there's a difference. And that is not clear to children, especially young children. Um, Young children are also sometimes encouraged to talk to a family member who's died. They might be told that grandma or grandpa's watching over them from heaven. Sometimes children are asked to draw a picture or write a note to the person so it could be placed in the coffin. Now, you know, that would make sense for maybe a teenaged person, somebody over the age of 10. But for young children, those requests and comments are really confusing. And they can even be really frightening to some children who do not yet understand the finality of death. In a young kid's mind, if a person dies and they can read a note, does that mean that they're going to be aware that they're in that coffin? Is that person going to be aware that they're buried? And is that going to really frighten that person
Mm.
who's in that coffin? Um, I can remember when my sister died, my daughter was in pre-K, so would that make her 4 or 5? And I said I was going to make a garden for Aunt Joan. And I was in my head, I make a memorial garden that's like in memory of my sister. And weeks later, we're getting out of the car, and my daughter said, "Is Aunt Joan hungry?" And I said, "Well, no, she's dead. Why do you think that she's hungry?" She says, "Well, why do you need to make a garden for her if she's not hungry?" And I kind of looked at her and did this, and I said, "Well, I'm making a flower garden so I can remember Aunt Joan. It's not to grow, cucumbers for Aunt Joan." So, do you see how concrete children are? And they also chew on things for a while. So, out of the blue, you'll get these like weird questions. It's like, why are you even asking that?
Mm.
But it was my fault. I mean, I didn't explain what the purpose of my garden
Yeah.
was for her.
And the concept is
Uh,
different for an adult. You see it totally differently. So obviously the child is pragmatic and he goes, okay, where is Aunt Mary now? Can we take
mhm,
some food to the tomb because she's gonna be hungry? Of course.
right. So, children may know that people can't move after they died, or they might believe that the coffin's too small. They may know that they're not going to be able to see the person who's died. Uh, they might think, well, it's really dark underground, so that they chew on this and they become preoccupied with what might be the physical suffering of the person who died. Like I told you, I was in kindergarten, my grandfather died, and I can remember to this day going in and looking at him, and you know how the the coffin, half of it is closed and had flowers on it. So all I could see was the upper part of his body. And I stood there and I was like, where are his legs? And I went through all these scenarios like, well, they must have cut off his legs because I can't see his legs. I don't know,
Mm.
like all I could see of his body was this. I didn't realize that that other half of the coffin was the rest of him because there was this curtain there. I couldn't see all the way down. And I can remember like, well, did they fold the legs underneath? How could they do that? My legs couldn't do that. And I said to my mom, where are the rest of his legs? And she said, they're in his coffin. Now, back in the early 60s, there wasn't a whole lot of, processing with children about what is it you mean, dear? It was like, this answer was like, it's right there. It's in the coffin. And I'm like, I don't see it. You know,
That's it.
this object constancy that children have, they see what's in front of them. They can't envision what they can't see. So you think, well, is as a child, is this person suffering because of what's going to happen to them? They're going to close that coffin. They're going to put them in the ground. This is horrible. So when children can correctly identify what living functions are, they can also understand that these functions end completely at the time of death. So, for example, only the living can think, and only the living can be afraid and feel hunger and feel pain. And only the living have a beating heart or a need to breathe. So we need to say these things to the children to get that sense of there's a difference between what living beings can do and that those things don't apply to dead beings.
All right,
So the
Marianne. But wait a minute. It's not just with children. Because you remember I told you about my grandma?
Mhm.
And she was probably not taught much from her own parents because I always remember she was always in and out of a hospital, bless her, because she had every disease, broken bones, so she was always in and out of a hospital, heart attacks. And she thought that one day she was going to die. And she always told us, when I die, because at 50 she thought she was an old woman. I'm old, I'm old. So when I die, remember, do not put my coffin under the ground because I can't breathe. Put it up high because in Italy they have walls and you have coffins that you put like in a drawer. She said, put me up there, otherwise I can't breathe. So she kept that belief.
Well, and think, the children in her life, they're thinking, well, what if, what if they weren't able to put her high up and they put her in, oh my God, what are you doing to grandma? So the third concept that we have to, that children have to understand is that death is inevitable. Everything that's alive eventually dies. As our nonprofit's called and our podcast is called, it's called Everyone Dies. And I can't tell you how many irate notes I get from adult people who say, we don't want to hear that.
Okay.
And my answer is always, but it's true. It's true. Everyone dies. Now, kids don't have enough life experience to realize that death is inevitable for all living things. Children might believe that they and others close to them will never die. Parents might reassure children that they are always going to be there to take care of them. They tell them not to worry about dying themselves. You don't have to worry about that. You're not going to die. Don't worry about me. I'm always going to be here. That's not true. That's really a lie. You don't know that you're always going to be here. And this comes from our wish to really shield our children from death. It's understandable. When a death directly affects a child, this reality can't be hidden anymore. When a parent or other significant person dies, children usually fear that others close to them, perhaps everyone that they care about, will also die. So children, just like adults, struggle to make sense of death. They don't understand that death is an inevitable part of life, that they'll have misunderstandings while trying to figure this out as to even why the death occurred. They may assume it happened because of something bad they did or something they failed to do. They may think it happened because of bad thoughts, and that can lead to guilt. Children may assume that the person who died, maybe they did bad things or they didn't do something that they should have done, and that's why they died. And then this can lead to shame. And these reactions make it difficult for children to adjust to a loss. Many children don't want to talk about the guilt, the death, because it exposes them to the feelings of guilt and to shame. And so if you have a child who's not willing to talk to you about it, kind of really be concerned about that child, because why is it they're not talking to them, to you about it? Why aren't they talking about it? And, there's some professional intervention there might be called for. But when we talk to children about how everyone eventually dies, children can raise concerns about the health and safety of their own family members. So if the child's concerned about the well-being of their parents, you can say, well, you can talk to your parents about that, or we can talk together about them. You can say, your parent is doing everything that they can do so that they can stay healthy and that they can hope and expect to live a long life. So, for example, if a child's father dies of a heart attack, the child might really benefit from knowing that his or her mother has seen a doctor, has had a physical exam, and this shows the child that family members are taking steps to stay healthy and safe. And this is totally different from telling the children that they or their parents are never going to die, because that's not true. But if you can say, I'm eating well, I go for my walks every night, I do that so that I can stay as healthy as I can, so I can be here for you. So you see, the message is different, and it reassures and it gets at the concern that the child is having. The last concept, the fourth concept, is causality. Because kids don't think abstractly, some young children don't understand that the causality of death, or that death is caused by physical reasons. So let me explain this. When children experience the death of a family member, a pet, or a friend, they need to understand why that death occurred. So if children don't understand the real reason for the death, they're going to come up with their own explanation that can cause guilt or shame. Do you see how it all just keeps going around in this circle with the guilt and shame woven in? The goal is to help the children understand what's happened. When you explain to a child, we should aim for a very brief explanation and use very simple and direct language. You don't have to be fancy. You can watch for cues from children. Allow them to ask for further explanations. Graphic details are not necessary and actually really should be avoided if their death was violent. So like if, somebody was shot or was, crushed in a car, it's really not necessary to go into the gory details of how it all went down. If the child asks and wants to know, it's like when you talk to a child about sex. You just answer their questions. Don't give more information. If they ask X, you answer X. If they want to know about Y, they'll ask you, but don't go into it unless they do. Now, although it would be unusual for a teacher to be the first person to tell an individual child about the death of a family member, teachers are in a position who have to make a class announcement about someone in the school or the community who's died, a classmate who's had a parent die or a family member die, or any other kind of death that affects students in a classroom or school. So who's telling and who's giving this information can really be anyone. So I think everybody really needs to be able to talk about death to a child. So how do we talk to children about death? What do we say? We need to be truthful. We need to give simple explanations. And we let the kids ask questions and give honest answers. So let me make this easy for you. There are three reasons that people die. They die because they're very, very sick. They die because they're very, very old. Or they die because they're very, very hurt. And that's the reasons that you give to a child. Any death of an animal or a flower or a people fits into those three things. That's all you have to remember. Very, very sick, very, very old, or very, very hurt. And the very, very is very, very important because we get sick, we get old, we get hurt. And I've used this model with my children since they were very, very little. And they're now in their late 20s. And I'll say, so and so is sick. And they'll say to me, are they very, very sick? They use it's a common language that we can talk about and know, oh, no, they're not very, very sick. They just have this. Or when they were little, when I would say, oh, God, I'm so sick, my cold or whatever. And they'd say, are you very, very sick? And I'd look at them and I'd say, no,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just sick. I'm not very, very sick. Because very, very sick people die. So use the very, very there. And I started this, and actually, we wrote a book called Everyone Dies. And actually, I have it right here. And this is my grandson on here. And this book came about because of a discussion that I had with him on a beach with you see, he's holding a claw, a clam claw, and the discussion about what happened to this clam. And it presents this model of very, very old and very, very sick and very, very hurt. And since then, I mean, Jax was really little when we wrote this book, but since then his dog died, and we were happened to be taking care of it because our son is a Marine and was in Japan, so we got the dog while they were gone, and while the dog was here, and the dog had a heart condition when we were taking care of him. He had his heart condition got worse and he was dying. And we called them in Japan so that they could also talk to him and say goodbye to the dog. And Jack said, what's wrong with him? And I said, he's very, very sick. Said his heart's not working the way it needs to, and his body can't live if his heart's not working that way. And he said to me, oh, okay. But from the time he was 3, that was the language we used with him. It didn't frighten him. It didn't scare him. He was sad that Brody was dying, but he understood everything dies. There's reasons why they die, and here's why.
That was amazing, Marianne. So much information in such a little time. And I hope that this was helpful for everyone to understand that we can talk about death and make sure the children don't get shocked and frightened, but understand it's a normal part of our life. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely day. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.